quelques mots en anglais. Dear guest, Jean-Jacques Perrin, the director of the French Institute and also the cultural counselor to the ambassador. It's really my privilege to welcome you tonight in order to pay a tribute to Dani Karavan. Dani Karavan, an immense artist dear to the art of France, an artist whose creative and unique language, the integration of the shape to the site, the connection between the human being and the environment, the resort of raw materials, perception and perspectives, the symbolic, political and poetic dimension of art is expressed in each and every work, in each and every masterpiece of his, as it is in Passages, a tribute to Walter Benjamin, which is going to be at the center of this event tonight. Before leaving the floor to Noa Karavan-Cohen, whom I warmly thank for this beautiful cooperation. Thank you so much, Noa. I would like also to express our gratitude to Aviva Levinson from the amazing Open House Tel Aviv. Our event is part of, as well as to the participants in tonight's exchange, Anne Tamisier, Miss Caravan collaborator for 30 years in Paris. Bravo. Activist Sigal Kook Avivi and philosopher Ori Rotlevy. Eventually, many thanks to Hava Karavan for honoring us with your participation in the discussion. Noa, the floor is yours, and I wish you all a very beautiful evening.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank the French Institute and Batim Bifnim Open Houses for this wonderful occasion. Thank you. And the idea was to talk about one of my father's work, which is the Passages in Portbou. This is where the German philosopher Walter Benjamin committed suicide, trying to escape from Nazi French, to freedom through Spain. And unfortunately, after he crossed the border and he thought that he was now safe, and he stayed in one of the hotels there, the Spanish police came and told him that the next day he had to present himself in the offices of the police. And he was probably very worried that they're going either to send him back or to prohibit him from going further. He wanted to arrive to the United States. And he called the doctor. It's not really clear what happened. One possibility is that he committed suicide. One possibility is that maybe he had a heart attack. Maybe somebody helped him a little bit. In any way, this was the place where he died. And my father was commissioned to do work to honor him in the place, in Portbou. And when we started discussing with the French Institute the idea of doing an evening here, we thought that it would be very appropriate to bring up the whole issue of the refugees, especially in view of what is happening today in Ukraine. And this is why we have Sigal Kook Avivi here, who will be our first speaker, and I will present her later. But before we start with her, I would like to show a short film. It's a 10-minute film where my father actually makes a guided tour in the work. So you will hear the concept and the ideas behind this project from him, from his mouth, which is very beautiful.
Remember when I came here many years ago, when I was trying to find a place for the memorial for Walter Benjamin, And I've seen this kind of phenomenon of the wind and tourbillon in the water, a strudel in the water. And I decided that nature is insisting that this is the place, and nature wanted to show the tragedy of Walter Benjamin. When I go down and I see light, so I went to the light. I didn't know that I had to go under the earth, and by that to create a kind of a tunnel, a dark tunnel that opens to the borders with a beautiful, strong landscape. So when we came out, we went to the light. I didn't think about it, but everybody said, you know, this is one of the ideas of Walter Benjamin, that he wants to go to the light, from the darkness to the light. So when I came up, and I see this wall of stone, I thought that the way should continue till a kind of blockage. It cannot go on. It means he's lost here. He cannot run away. When I came here and I find out this kind of phenomenon in nature, I said I should look for other phenomena. Maybe there are other elements that will tell the story. And I choose this olive tree here on the side because it looks so poor, fighting on the nature against the salt wind, against the rocks. But after some times, I saw, when he found out that he was chosen, he started to be big and nice. I said, no, this is not what I need. So then we go up, and the way is terrible. And everybody said, you should pave it. I said, no, this is the way of Walter Benjamin. He was walking on this kind of rocks and stones, and I want everybody physically to feel it, that it's not easy. His way was not easy. He came here, he said, I cannot continue. I will die if I will not sit here and wait a little bit. And so sometimes they wanted to pay, but I didn't agree. But maybe now we have to correct it a little bit. The time it became much more difficult. Oh, because I became older. So now I find the other olive tree here, like leaning on the wall of the cemetery. And I decide this is the one that I will choose to show the fight for life, the resistance against all the difficulties of nature, and to continue to live. But now, after many years I come here, so many olive trees came around to participate to this kind of event, and I like it very much. So I build here that people will understand that this belongs to the work. I build a staircase from iron, from curtain, so to mention clearly that this tree is part of the work. Then I find this cactus, that in Arabic the name is Sabre. I am Sabre, because I was born in Israel. And I said, what are you doing here? You belong to me, you belong to my country. And he said, not. I came from South America. The Spanish people who conquered South America brought it back here, and from here it came to Israel, to Palestine. So this also has to do with the theory of Benjamin. Then I came here behind the church, and I found a plaza, a place. And I said, here people can meditate. So I put here a very simple platform, so people can sit here by themselves, alone, looking through the fence to the ocean, to the freedom. Behind is the cemetery, and here people could sit and listen to the wind, to the birds, which now they are not singing because the wind is too strong, to the sea, and also the trains for crossing here the border, which remember other trains. But this border here was really very important for humanity. First, the Republican escape from the Franco-fascist regime to France, and then people ran away from the Nazi and Vichy regime in the Second World War. When we go back, the back of the cemetery, we are on the back of the cemetery, and we open the door, and we have the cypress, the steps, the staircase going down to the sea, like a kind of variation of the tunnel. But this I didn't know. After I did the tunnel, I came here and I said, yes, nature itself created a tunnel, but no tourbillon. Anne Adams, she wrote that this is the most beautiful cemetery she ever sees in her life. This has been done when we put the first stone. We put also the first stone of the foundation of the memorial. We also put this stone with this terrible citat. And this is very important because all the idea of passage of this work is really to make all this tour and to go through the cemetery and to see the stone and to come back, and by that the ring is closed. It's a kind of a ring. And you come here, and you see the beginning. But now I want to say something about this tree here. This tree was here before. All these three trees. This tree, this is bending, like running away. But I find it here, and I think, and integrate it. I was working also a lot about the distance, because I believe in distance. Distance creates tension. So I could make it closer or further, but this is really the point to put them, to create this kind of tension. And the way he's growing up is incredible. Like it was done before I did it. Like this through me, that something like that will happen to them.
I want to invite Sigal Kook Avivi. I will say a few words about Sigal. Sigal is a social and human rights activist. She has been involved specifically in the struggle for the rights of refugees and asylum seekers in Israel since 2011. In the past 10 years, Sigal turned all her resources and energy to fight for the moral character of Israeli society, aiming to stop the expulsion of Africans who seek asylum within Israel and allowing them to stay until they can return to their country safely. She began to teach Hebrew to the refugees, and shortly after, she found herself visiting Cholot facility, she will speak about it, once a week, immersed in a daily struggle to recognize asylum seekers as refugees and to improve their lives. After human rights organizations almost gave up on fighting with the government and the High Court of Justice, which authorized the deportation to a third country, Rwanda, Sigal led a petition to the High Court of Justice with another 119 citizens. In March 2018, the High Court ordered the government to freeze the deportation process following that petition. She continues to work in the field of human rights, working directly with Israel's refugees and asylum-seeking population. In 2018, Sigal won the Yeshayahu Leibovitch Prize for her important work with refugees and asylum seekers in Israel.
Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me, Noa. I was very excited. First of all, I'm a great admirer of Dani Karavan's work. I've always been. It's interesting. I've never, when you told me about his work, the passages, it fits so correctly with the issue of the refugees because, as you mentioned, I work with the refugees, and the whole notion of passage between darkness to light. Unfortunately, the refugees in Israel haven't reached light yet. They have, as your father explained, they came across the brick wall. And the whole issue of the sea as well, because a lot of refugees, the Mediterranean has become the largest grave of refugees in the current times, refugees coming from Africa. So it's very important for me to speak about this issue. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to speak about my personal experiences or give you more information. It was a debate I had between myself, but I thought it would be important for you to understand a few things. So excuse me of having it as a lecture with a lot of information. And I want to start with the 1951 Refugee Convention, which Israel was one of the initiators of this convention. The state, after we as a state understood the importance of dealing with refugees, Israel was, as I said, initiated this and also signed the convention. And the convention is important to understand because we heard many words describing the asylum seekers. We hear migrant workers, we hear infiltrators, of course, we hear the word of all kinds of different words to describe them, and it's important to understand that they are really refugees. Israel has not recognized them as such, but the legal term would be asylum seekers because this is what they are seeking. They came to here, Israel, they fled their countries seeking for asylum. So if we have a second to look, the term of refugee shall apply to any person who owing well-founded fear of being persecuted for the reason of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and is outside of its country and his nationality and is unable or is unwilling to seek protection in his own country. You can put the other. So, what are the rights that refugees have under the Geneva Convention? They have the right to work, they have the right to education, they have the right to freedom of movement, and also they have the right for identification documents, which they do not have in Israel, unfortunately. The protections that are guaranteed by the conventions are normally for not deporting them to a country where they stand danger, not to be discriminated and not to be prosecuted due to the fact that they illegally entered the country. As asylum seeker, you are allowed to enter a country illegally. That is the only way you can enter a country. When you flee a country, you normally don't have passports. You normally can't go through the border control. You would have to enter a country illegally. That does not make you an infiltrator. Okay, how many people, how many asylum seekers are at the moment? And I'm giving this, I'm sorry it's in Hebrew, but the numbers are important. And this is, all the information I have is to the Authority of Population and Immigration. It's not the numbers I have, it's the numbers, official numbers. And at the moment in Israel, there are a little less than 27,000 asylum seekers in Israel altogether. I marked in green just for us to keep in mind the amount of true migrant workers, which I'm completely, again, not against. But you see the numbers, there are 103,000 and 22,000 and over 30,000 people that entered Israel with a tourist visa and have not renewed it. So you can see the numbers, they're staggering compared to the little amount of the asylum seekers. The numbers also tell the story of the fact that Israel needs working hands. Not that I think that we should have the asylum seekers working as the mundane jobs they do, but Israel needs the working hands. So all its persecution with the asylum seekers is almost ridiculous. The next slide. In Israel, the number of asylum seekers from, mostly the people in Israel, most of the refugees in Israel are from Eritrea and Sudan. And you see that at the moment, these, by the way, the numbers are from the last April. So the numbers of Eritrea are a little over 20,000. The numbers of the Sudanese are less than 4,000. And then we have refugees from other African countries, over 2,000, and from the rest of the world, which of course it doesn't include the numbers of Ukraine, but we're talking about this. Okay, where it's important to understand where the asylum seekers are. Wait, hold on a second. I'm sorry, I'll go to my, what I wrote. So as we said, there's about 27,000 adult asylum seekers living in Israel. They consist of 91% of the 91% of them are from Sudan and Eritrea. The estimate is about 8,000 children. Mostly were born here in Israel. They're not included in that 27,000. As I said, according to the data to the Population and the Immigration Authority, there are currently about 26,700 asylum seekers here. Okay. Asylum seekers fled brutal dictatorships, wars, genocide, and other atrocities, forcing them to leave their homes and their homelands. About 4,000 of them in Israel, that are in Israel, are the survivors of the Sinai torture camps, and they carry scars of cruel torturement on their body and in their minds. We think, with the estimation is that over 10,000 asylum seekers were murdered in the Sinai desert when they tried to cross the border, and they were brutally tortured. Their living in Israel, officially, is regulated under the government policy of temporary protection. And the state of Israel recognized the danger to their lives if they return to their countries of origin. Although most of the asylum seekers have been here in Israel since 2006, 2007, and despite the official recognition of the danger that they face if they return to their homelands, Israel denies them recognition and status as refugees. Thousands of asylum seeker applications have been submitted and haven't been proceeded yet. Some have been waiting for at least 7 years for their asylum seeker, their refugee status determination to come to work. There was another screen, but I'll come back to that. In addition, I wanted to compare it to the high numbers, the high rates of recognition that asylum seekers from Eritrea and Sudan receive around the world. The Eritreans receive almost 90% of recognition around the world, and the Sudanese over 60%. And when we're talking about, in Israel, the rate is less than 0.5%. This long-standing government policy regarding the asylum seekers has left them in a state of limbo, the darkness that they haven't yet emerged. On that one hand, Israel recognized that they cannot deport asylum seekers, but at the same time it deprives them of services such as social security benefits, health insurance, and other social services, thereby denying them their human rights. I'd like to talk about countries of origin. So most of the asylum seekers in Israel, as I said, arrived from Eritrea and Sudan. However, there are a few who came from other countries in Africa and other parts of the world seeking protections from political or personal oppression, such as gender and sexual orientation. And we know now that the Ministry of the Interior is trying to deny the protection of gender violation. So Eritrea is a country. Can you go back to the Eritrea? Sorry, I started with Eritrea. If not, never. No, the map of Eritrea. Okay. So anyway, Eritrea is a country in the East Africa with a population of only 6 million people. Look how small the tiny state it is, and it has succeeded to gain its independence. By the way, yesterday the Eritreans were celebrating their independence, not their freedom, from Ethiopia after a 30-year war. And Ethiopia is a gigantic country compared to Eritrea, but they fought vigorously to get their liberation. So as I said, there are a population of 6 million people, and despite its small population, and Eritrea actually makes one of the world's largest exports of refugees in the world. It is estimated that about between 10 to 25% of the population has fled Eritrea. I'd also like to mention at this point that Israel holds diplomatic and also economical relationships with Eritrea. So actually we're backing up the dictator of Eritrea. So sometimes I say if you do not want to deal with refugees, maybe we should stop supporting dictators. Eritrea is considered one of the most repressive dictatorships in the world. It has one-party regime led by the dictator Isaias Afwerki since 1991. They have no free elections, no freedom of press, no freedom of religion. The country has a mandatory conscription. Sorry, I'm never succeeding saying the word to the army. A compulsory military service for the entire population. The date of the discharge of the military service is unknown, and the military service sometimes lasts years till the mid-50s or sometimes 60s. The military service, which Israel used the excuse not to recognize them as refugees, which is not really military service, includes forced labor, and there are arbitrary punishment during military service, also sexual assault, slavery, and so on. Any attempt to oppose the government or the military, or any attempt to escape the country is met with imprisonment for an unknown duration and even torture. Eritrea denies its residents from fundamental human rights and freedom, including political rights, freedom of expression of movement. The government imprisons and harasses journalists who criticize it, including foreign journalists. And it restricts the entry of humanitarian and human rights organizations into the country. Actually, Eritrea gained the nickname of North Korea's Africa. Sudan. You can move to the other one, to the other screen. Sudan is located in northeast Africa. The last map. Never mind. Sudan is located in the northeast Africa, and it is the third largest country in the continent, and is one of the poorest countries in the world. It has been liberated by it was liberated from the British occupation in 1956. And during the first decades of its existence, it suffered many revolutions and internal conflicts. It still does. In 1989, the General Omar Bashir led a military coup, and he appointed himself to the president and ruled Sudan for 30 years until 2019. Al-Bashir dictatorship's rule was particularly cruel, and for years basically what he tried to create was ethnic cleansing of the non-Arab tribes. In Darfur region, in the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile. In the Darfur region, the numbers are 500,000 of people were murdered. We believe that the numbers are much, much larger. The world stopped counting after a certain time. And also 3 million of displaced people that had to live in displacement camps in Sudan. The ICC, the court in Hague, actually, he was requested, and now he's judged for crimes against humanity and for genocide, crimes of genocide. He was by the coup that they started in 2018. He was ousted, and he has been tried for corruption. Nothing yet with the genocide. At the moment, there's a civil military transitional government, which is also not functioning very well. They had a coup again in October, and the situation in Sudan is very bad. There's still persecution. The murdering militias are still killing many people, and also in the displacement camps. Okay, so the asylum seekers in Israel. As I said, more than 15,000 asylum seekers have requested asylum seeker. Their status determination. Less than 0.5% actually were submitted, processed. And as I said, the comparison in Europe or around the world is staggering. Here it says here, you see that in, like, for instance, 93% in Sweden, almost 87% in USA, 89% in Norway, in the UK 88%, even that now the UK is starting to talk about something okay. As I said, you can go to the other ones. I just wanted to mention a few things. Now, you can see that the numbers of asylum seekers entering Israel in general. Do I have to press this? Yes. In the number of through all the years, starting in 2006, doesn't add up to over to 64,000. There were never 64,000 asylum seekers in Israel. There were only 43,000 together. And you can see the first years they had entries of, like, say 2,000, and the peak of the entrance was in 2011, and in 2012 Israel started building a fence and also started imprisoning the asylum seekers. I have a graph showing that ever since the fence was built, if you can go to the graph, the numbers of the asylum seekers, before the fence even finished building it, you can go to the graph, you can see the numbers actually dropped dramatically, and the last few years, since 2016, 2017, there are hardly anybody. Sometimes it says zero, completely zero asylum seekers enter Israel. And you have to remember that Israel has persecuted the asylum seekers and still is persecuting the asylum seekers. It's planned its forceful deportation in 2018, while there were no asylum seekers coming into Israel, only leaving them, unfortunately. If you can go to the next. The government decision 3936, as I said, constructed of a barrier on Israel-Western border that they started building in 2012 and finished by the end, amended the anti-infiltration law. That was a law that came to life in 1952, where Israel tried to prevent refugees, the Palestinian refugees that left to Jordan, and when they started to come back to their own homes, they were prevented with this anti-infiltration law. Gideon Saar, he was the Minister of Interior. He was the one, by the way, who named them, labeled them very smartly, Machiavelli almost, as infiltrators, because till 2012, people didn't really know how to call them. He decided to call them infiltrators, and he also renewed the anti-infiltration law, which basically was against people coming from enemy states, like Jordan and so forth, so forth. They had a problem because Eritrea was not an enemy state, so they had to change the law in order to create a situation where they can use it for asylum seekers mostly coming from a state that is not an enemy state. So, and also they had the established detention center for asylum seekers. Saroni wasn't enough. They opened an open prison detention facility, Cholot, and also the enforcements against employers, also taking the deposit law, and expelling asylum seekers to countries, or third countries, still went on. Go on to the next. As I said, Israel recognized the mortal danger asylum seekers face if they return to their countries of origin, and it does not deport them back, so-called does not deport them back. What it does give them, it gives them, as you can see, it's called temporary release. Now it says temporary license, but it used to say conditional release, as you can see. This is the piece of paper that asylum seekers are given in Israel. They have to renew it every few months. Now the Sudanese have to renew it once a year, but generally they have to renew it every few months, and it's a big procedure. But you can see, and so what's important to see that they are here legally. In contrary to what Israel is saying, or what the Israeli population is saying, that they're not legal in Israel, they are legal. They are given a piece of paper, gives them nothing as truly, but they have a piece of paper that they have to renew every few months. And what I wanted you to take notice, the biggest thing in this small piece of paper, which by the way they cannot put in nylon, they have to keep it always, is a piece of paper that it always tears. And I remember an asylum seeker once telling me that he had the authority police coming to him, and he quickly took it out of his pocket, and it actually tore in his hands, and he was so afraid of the consequences. But as you can see, this temporary license is not a license for work. It does not permit you to work. And of course, this is the only piece of paper that permits them to work in Israel. It's a whole story of how Israel is basically trying to keep both the employers and the asylum seekers under in a limbo, as I say. Okay, so there have been many attempts to deport the asylum seekers in the past. The deportation of Eritrean and Sudanese asylum seekers from Israel violates the international law, violates the obligation of the non-refoulement, and it also violates the international law prohibition of discrimination. No matter the language that government use, the transfers of Eritreans and Sudanese nationalities to Rwanda and to Uganda are truly not voluntarily. They are they are not based on free and informed consent of the individual concerned. Up to 2018, the Israeli authorities used indefinite detention or its threat as a main tool effectively to force Eritreans and Sudanese to leave Israel. Israel called that voluntarily deportation, which it wasn't. I want to also remind you that in 2012, Israel has deported asylum seekers from South Sudan, around 1,000 asylum seekers to Sudan, that was founded only half a year before. And as we predicted, civil war broke there. Many of these asylum seekers had to flee again, and many of them were murdered, including children. The project of whoever is familiar of Come True project is taking some of the asylum seekers from South Sudan to Uganda and putting them in a boarding school. So as I said, this Israel called it voluntary relief, and then Israel moved to forceful deportation. In 2018, the Israeli government proposed a plan stipulating that asylum seekers from Sudan and Eritrea who have submitted their applications for asylum by early January 2018, or asylum seeker applications that were denied, were candidates for forcible deportation to the third country, Rwanda and Uganda. That haven't clearly agreed to accept them if they were deported forcefully, but Israel kind of found ways around it. Testimonies of numerous asylum seekers who left Israel voluntarily and went to Uganda and Rwanda made it clear that they did not enjoy any status protection in these countries. They were subject to imprisonment and hard life and also on the merge of society. They often became refugees again, trying to reach Europe via Libya, therefore dying, many of them in the sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. This journey was very dangerous and in multiple places, and it claimed the lives of many of the asylum seekers that were deported from Israel. I actually claim that around 40,000 asylum seekers were deported from Israel. My estimate is that around, let's say, 15,000 arrived to Europe or to the United States, so the rest of them, we have no account for them. And I heard stories of asylum seekers. I traveled to Uganda to take testimonies. I traveled later to Swiss and Germany. And I heard testimonies from the asylum seekers telling me of how dangerous this route was. And one of the asylum seekers summed it very nicely. He said, "We left Israel 10, we survived 3. Asylum seekers who refused to be deported from Israel were imprisoned in the Saronim facility in the Negev detention center." Do I have more time, or would you? Not really. Okay, so there's many more information I would like to give, but I can't. I tried to pick pictures of their struggles. We struggled against the deportation. As Noa mentioned, we petitioned as activists to the Supreme Court, and luckily we succeeded to show them that basically it wasn't a moral question. The Supreme Court said that Israel has failed to show the Supreme Court an agreement with Rwanda, and therefore the deportation has halted. Since then, refugees are, as I said, in a limbo. They have no health security. They have problems with work. They're very, truly desperate and trying still to leave Israel to try to find a better future. I didn't mention at the beginning, I just wanted to say that when I started dealing with the asylum seekers, it was mostly because of my daughter. She volunteered in the UNHCR, and she pushed me to try and do something with the asylum seekers. I didn't know what to do, so she signed me up for teaching them Hebrew. That's how I started. But when I think of it today, or when I understood, the reason I am dealing with the asylum seekers is my grandmother, as I tell the refugees many times, was an infiltrator. She entered Israel in 2022, 100 years ago. She fled Ukraine through Poland, and this is how all the cycles are closing. We have to remember, we have an obligation toward these asylum seekers. We have a human obligation, we have an obligation from the Bible, and we never know. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to ask you one question to bring it back to the story of Walter Benjamin, and we spoke about it. It's the journeys and the feeling of home, and Ori Rotlevy is going to speak about it later as well. But Walter Benjamin actually fled from Germany to France. He never felt at home in France, but it was his first journey. Then his second journey was towards the United States, and during this second journey, he was actually stopped on the way, and he had the idea that he was going. And you spoke about it as well, the fact that they don't feel at home here, and the fact that the second journey is almost impossible after the first journey. So if you can just...
Yes, there are a few things I'd like to say. As I told you, one of the girls that we met, actually she's studying now in the university in Herzliya, but when we met her, she was a South Sudanese that was deported. You know, she made the whole journey to Israel and was deported to South Sudan. She's also a refugee now again. She told me, one of the meetings we said, I will never find a home. But I also want to say something else about the refugees here are very desperate. They are here many, many years. But some of the refugees, one of them that was actually as a son to me, he left to Canada in October, and he didn't want to leave. He kept saying, Israel's my home, Israel's my home, I don't want to leave Israel. He came to live with me when he was 14. He told me, he said, you know, if Israel is a home, Israel will always be a home, part of me. It will be part of me. I speak Hebrew. I love your culture. I feel Israeli in many ways. But it doesn't, Israel will never recognize me as a refugee, so I have to move on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, she needs to go, so...
So sorry.
I would like to invite my mother.
No, I don't want to sit.
You don't want to sit?
No.
Okay. So,
Do I have to do anything?
no, I think we can.
So, good evening. I will be more personal. So, I was a refugee as a child. I started my life in Poland. So there was the Polish, then they came the German, then I was in Russia, then I was in Uzbekistan, then I was back in Poland, and then I came to Israel. And I always told Dani, you know, it was always a miracle. My escape was a miracle. My life was saved 5 times. It was always a miracle. So Dani said to me, sure, you had to survive because I was waiting for you. So that's what happened. And we've been together for many years, a Sabra and a refugee. So, about a few words about Walter Benjamin, because you will have another speakers who know his philosophy. I should tell about le côté d'artiste. It means when Dani got the commission, suddenly got the commission and said, wow, I know his name, because the director of my school, who was a refugee from Germany, she was always speaking about Walter Benjamin, how brilliant he was, what an open-minded person he was, how human and humanistic he was. And then Dani got suddenly the commission. He said, you see, things are coming somehow really unexpected. And then I went with him to Portbou, a little village, really not something special. Something special, they have the sea. And once the village was very important for trade, and even the railway station was built by Eiffel, the man who made the tower in Paris. And then we were all around, and Dani said, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Then he decided I must use the sea and the cemetery. So what am I going to do about the sea? And then, I don't know if you went to Portbou to see the project. You could see a little bit here, but not enough. When you go down the tunnel, it's dark and you don't feel good. You don't feel safe. And you go down the steps, you don't like it so much. And then suddenly, the sky opens, and the sea opens, and you see the other shore, and you see, wow, how nice. That's freedom. That's freedom here, here, here. But you come to the end, and there is a glass wall. No, you cannot go through it. It's no way. It's the end. And then we can turn back and get out of the tunnel. But Walter Benjamin, unfortunately, he couldn't go back. For him, it was the end of the journey. And when you go down the tunnel, you feel like Walter Benjamin felt when he knew it's no way for me to continue. It's why Dani's project is so meaningful that everybody who goes there feels the feeling of Walter Benjamin, that here is the end. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to call Anne Tamisier, please. Anne. And Yael Karavan, my sister, who will so Anne Tamisier. Actually, we have another very important guest here tonight, who is Andreas Heim, the beautiful Anne Tamisier. and we have Andreas Heim here as well. Andreas was, I think, you were my father's first assistant. Andreas actually met him in Germany and said, "I'm coming to work with you." And my father said, "I don't need an assistant. I don't have an assistant." And Andreas said, "I don't care. I'm coming. I'm coming. You don't have to pay me. I'm going to be in the studio, and then we'll see." And he just came from Germany to Paris, and in the office. And until today, we've got boxes. Andreas is very organized, so we've got boxes with his hand writing on it. And Andreas came especially now for this event. But you were already not there when Dani worked on this project. I think you've already left. And Anne arrived in 1990. And so, yes, she's been working with my father for more than 30 years. And apart from the fact that she's very beautiful. and she does a wonderful mahak. And she, as Andreas, they all speak a bit of Hebrew, like Manishma, and they can speak among them. But for Anne, we, in the family, and my father also, we used to call her Dani's hands. She became really like Dani's hands. For many years, Dani was working and did his models from plastiline, the material that allows him to change forms and make them bigger and smaller and add and so on. And since Anne arrived, Anne became the specialist on plastiline, but not only plastiline, also in other things. And Dani could just stand a little sketch or explain to her over the phone what she wanted, what he wanted, and she knew. And at a certain stage when he was more here than in Paris, some people told him, "Why do you need an assistant in Israel? In Paris, you can do it here." And he tried a few things and he said, "Anne has the techusha." The other people that don't have the techusha. So Anne is here with us. And I actually wanted to ask you, in the background, maybe we should move a little bit so people can see the... Should I put over here maybe? Because I wanted to be able to see the... Yeah. We've got in the background some sketches that Dani made. Some sketches were done before the work was done, and some sketches were done after the work was done. But as Yael, my sister, Anne speaks French, so Yael, my sister, will translate to English. And basically, I just wanted to ask you your memories of the process of working on this project with Dani.
Alors, pour ce projet, ça s'est passé comme ça s'est passé pour tous les autres, en fait. C'est-à-dire que Dani avait l'habitude de travailler sur des maquettes pour toute la conception de ses projets.
For this project, oh, hello.
Maybe we have to take it
the mute. Oh, now? Okay. So for this project, it happened, no.
There's the big green.
I don't think this way.
Hello. Yeah. So for this project, it happened like in any other project process. We worked with a model.
Yes. I continue.
Yes, you continue.
On a l'habitude souvent d'envisager les maquettes comme des objets de présentation.
We feel that models are like something that represent the work, like we show it to other people.
Mais Dani utilisait, pour Dani c'était un outil, un véritable outil de travail.
But it was a working tool for Dani.
Pour toutes les œuvres qu'il a conçues, le site était l'inspiration.
For all the works that he created, the site was his inspiration.
Donc il allait sur le site sur lequel il devait intervenir. Il faisait un voyage, c'était plus ou moins loin de la base de Tel Aviv ou de Paris.
He went to the site where he was creating the work, which normally was a little bit further from the base where he was, that was Paris or Tel Aviv.
Et il regardait, il écoutait, il sentait le lieu.
He looked, he listened, and he felt the space, the site.
Il revenait avec tout ce que le lieu lui avait donné.
He came back with everything that the space gave him to feel or to see.
Et ensuite, son travail consistait à toute la conception. Il se passait toutes ces choses se passaient à l'intérieur de lui. Et les maquettes, donc je faisais les maquettes des sites sur lesquels il allait intervenir. Et là, le travail commençait. C'est-à-dire qu'il pouvait transformer ce qu'il avait entendu, senti, ressenti sur les maquettes.
He came with all these feelings and all these experiences in the different places that he went, and then in the models he could express all his experience and share it with Anne, that then they could transform it into a model.
Et ensuite, en fait, il vérifiait, il créait, il développait ses idées sur la maquette et il les vérifiait. Est-ce que ça marchait vraiment? Et est-ce que les proportions, est-ce que les différents éléments, est-ce que tout ça s'harmonisait? Est-ce que tout fonctionnait? C'était
He was checking if his first inspirations, if his ideas, if everything that he was feeling was actually working in the 3-dimension of the models. This was the process.
Do you remember anything specific on this project? Do you have any specific memories from this particular project?
Je me souviens que pour ce projet, enfin, cette histoire du tourbillon dont il parle, c'était vraiment, c'était comment dire, c'était ça. C'était ça le projet. Il était. Après, il y avait des contraintes techniques énormes parce qu'il fallait quand même traverser la falaise pour construire ce tunnel en cortège. Mais c'était devenu une évidence. Enfin, ce tourbillon et tout ce que ça racontait, toute l'histoire de Benjamin était là. Le projet était là.
Yeah, it was this tourbillon, this little storm, whirlpool in the sea. This rock and the water just hitting it was really something that he retained, and he felt that all the story of Walter Benjamin was there in this struggle, in this something not quite. That was the essence that he found in the nature.
And continuing, and she said that afterwards there was a lot of technical problems.
Yeah, there were technical problems of how to actually create that tunnel
in the rock.
Yeah, how to put the focus into that.
How to carve it into the rock.
Carve it into the rock. You can do the translation. You are multi-talented.
Did you travel with him to Port-Bon? Were you there with him?
Not with him. I go there. Très tardivement, j'ai vu à l'occasion d'une exposition qu'on a, des sculptures de terre que Dani a créées en 2015, enfin, qui ont été exposées en 2015 au musée de Céret, donc à 2 pas en fait, tout près de de Porto. Là, j'ai pu faire le voyage jusqu'à Porto.
It's only in 2015 when Dani presented his earth pieces in Serres, which was in south of France, very near to the border of Porto, that only then did Anne see the work of Passages in Porto.
Et ce qu'a dit Hava est tout à fait exact. Il faut aller là-bas pour vivre. Et comme tous les projets de Dani d'ailleurs, les œuvres sont très belles à voir en images, mais elles sont bien plus que ça. Elles sont bien plus que très belles. Elles racontent beaucoup d'autres choses, mais il faut les arpenter.
Yeah, it's okay. Arpenter, je vais pas arpenter, non? Il faut les arpenter. Voilà. Sorry, in English. So she says, yeah, now in Hebrew. No, I can in Portuguese as well. Yeah, she says that the works of Dani are very visually striking and they're very beautiful to see in an image, but like Hava said, you have to go and have the experience, because it's there that really the work of Dani was an experience, is for people to really be inside them, to go through them and raconter. Voilà. Non?
Mais ici en Israël, vous avez beaucoup de projets splendides à arpenter.
But here in Israel also, you have a lot of wonderful works of Dani that you can arpenter as well.
One last question. Do you remember the choice of material? Because this tunnel from Corten, I mean, Corten is not really a material that Dani used a lot of in his works. It's usually like concrete and white concrete. And Corten is kind of like a bit of an unusual material. Do you remember talking with him about it? About why did not?
Köln, il a utilisé déjà.
Yes, because
he already used it in Cologne in Germany.
That's cast iron. Cast iron.
Ah, it's cast iron. Okay.
Because I remember talking to him about it, and because I asked him, I mean, why Corten? Why did you think about Corten? And he said that he was looking for a material that would be, he felt that the white concrete was not the right material, and he was looking for a material that, again, would suit the environment. Like he said, you know, nature spoke to him, and he would ask nature, can I use this material? And nature said, no, you can't. So, and then he saw that in the rocks, there were like black marks. And he asked what it was, and he was told that it was kind of, in the rocks themselves, there was some kind of iron or matechet, I don't know what to say. And then this idea came to him that it was the right material for that was actually some kind of metal, and not the white concrete. Thank you.
I'm going to look up something and I'll tell you in a minute.
So finally, Shailot, at the end I will. Finally, I would like to invite Dr. Ori Rotlevy. Dr. Ori Rotlevy is a scholar of continental philosophy, focusing on ethics, political philosophy, and critical theory. He has published extensively on Walter Benjamin regarding topics such as the problem of freedom and the role of tradition in critical discourse. As a Richards Fellow at the Minerva Humanities Center at Tel Aviv University, he directs a research group titled Tradition, Canon, Transmission, and Critique. He teaches at Tel Aviv University and the Rajman University.
Hello everyone, and thank you Noa for the invitation and Yael Baruch for everything regarding the evening. I'm really delighted and honored to be part of this event, this tribute to Dani Karavan, and to introduce you a bit to Walter Benjamin's work. And the combination of the whirlpool, the tourbillon, in the sea below and the tree above in Karavan's passages, the monument, epitomizes the struggle of the refugee, the struggle to find a place to be, a meaningful place to live, to grow, while there are powers that endanger one's very life, that threaten to tear apart everything. Thus, Karavan, in the tour we saw, designates the strudel, the tourbillon, the whirlpool, as the tragedy of Benjamin, who ended his life at Portbou fleeing the Nazis and could not find a home or even a place of refuge. It is also significant that this homage to Walter Benjamin is called Passages, inspired by his uncompleted magnum opus, Das Passagenwerk, the Arcades project, which has been partially translated to Hebrew recently, Projekta Passaging. And I would argue that Karavan's work urges us to think of Benjamin's Arcades project as implicitly dealing with the question of finding refuge, of the very possibility of finding a home in modern times. Thus, rather than telling the familiar story of the last days of Benjamin's life, I would like us to use this special evening dedicated to the intersection of Karavan's work, Walter Benjamin, and the drama of the refugee, in order to ask, could Walter Benjamin have found a home in the world if he would have not committed suicide at Portbou? Can we learn something from that concerning the contemporary problem of refugees attempting to find a home in our world? So, first, what are Benjamin's passages, Benjamin's Arcades project? So we're talking about the drafts he worked on from 1927 up to his death, intermittently. A historical philosophical work on modernity that was aimed to wake up his contemporaries so they might recognize the world in which they live in, a world that long before the Nazis came to power, Benjamin saw as hell. Le Passage de Paris, the Parisian Arcades, okay, that's a picture from now, initially stood at the center of Benjamin's work, for he thought of them as an emblem of the dynamics of high capitalism. So we have here the first segment of the work, which is mainly built of citations, and this passage as well. In speaking of the inner boulevard, says the illustrated guide to Paris, a complete picture of the city on the Seine and its environs from the year 1852, we have made mention again and again of the arcades which open onto them. These arcades, a recent invention of industrial luxury, are glass-roofed, marble-paneled corridors extending through whole blocks of buildings, whose owners have joined together for such enterprises. Lining both sides of these corridors, which get their light from above, are the most elegant shops, so that the arcade is a city, a world in miniature, in which customers will find everything they need. During sudden rain showers, the arcades are a place of refuge for the unprepared, to whom they offer a secure, if restricted, promenade, one from which the merchants also benefit. So, the arcades, then, are specific architectural sites that were very fashionable during the first half of the 19th century. And what I find fascinating in this text is that it exemplifies how Benjamin takes marginal sources, such as a tourist guide, on topics that are seemingly marginal as well, and constructs from them a fascinating and complex structure for understanding modern life and experience. So what we have here, okay, is merely a citation from a tourist guide from the 19th century that was aimed to guide people to enjoy the pleasures of the beautiful city and enter this new invention, these arcades filled with shops, arcades which the author describes as a world in miniature, right? Benjamin does not combine this source in a narrative of consumption history, namely how the department stores replaced the arcades and then were replaced by the malls. His interest is not to tell us a story of development, but rather to interrupt the historical continuum, to bring his contemporaries to reflect on their world and see whether they should take part in its continuation, in the inheritance of capitalism. He aims to construct from the materials of history an alarm clock that would wake them up and show them in the most concrete manner what it means to inherit the seemingly progressive world of the 19th century. Benjamin is trying in his work to present this world, not to provide a partial representation of it from a certain perspective. He wants to embody in the text, through multiple citations, various voices, this world which capitalism, with all its contradictions, produces. Pleasure and suffering, life and death, fantasies and moments of awakening, illusions and the flickering of truth. For that sake, he takes very seriously the insight that the arcade is a world in miniature. For what is a miniature? A presentation of something big and complex in a small scale, without losing the details, so one can grasp the whole. A large part of the Arcades project shows to what extent the world of the 19th century is embodied in the arcades in a dense manner. Thus, for instance, in various places, he takes this citation I read, along with other citations, and shows that the arcades themselves were outdated after a short period of glamour. In his time, most of the arcades in Paris were already destroyed. But it's not merely that it is an outdated invention replaced by the department stores. Even when the arcades were en vogue, they were the site in which the most novel inventions were presented as commodities. And thus, they were also the site where they turned to be outdated too, as commodities, outdated commodities. Namely, the arcade is a miniature of the dynamics that characterize the capitalist world, a world that innovates constantly in favor of profit and throws its productions as outdated very shortly. It's a miniature of the eternal return of innovation and the death of the new. And yeah, we can think of high tech. In this context. So this was Paris for Benjamin. Now, there can be much pleasure from wandering around in this world. Those of you who love the escapism of malls can identify with this, maybe. Indeed, the tourist guide describes the arcades as a magical and pleasant world that provides refuge from the outside. But with Benjamin's Arcades project, the idea was to bring the reader to determine whether this is a world worth living in, or whether it is actually hell, a world in which there is nothing that is truly meaningful. Benjamin thought of his Arcades project as his most significant work, one that could bring thought in his time to a standstill, and could transform how his contemporaries saw history. A truly revolutionary work, not in the sense of a constitution of a new order, but rather as the interruption of the old one. When he found refuge in Paris after the rise of the Nazis to power in 1933, he did not find a home in a very deep sense. For him, Paris was the capital of the 19th century, of the high development of capitalism. And as a Marxist, although a very heterodox Marxist, he worked for 13 years to present Paris and the capitalist world so as to awaken his contemporaries to its problematics, to its horrors, to make it impossible to find a home in it, to recognize it as hellish. In this sense, his plan to join his friends Adorno and Horkheimer in New York was not a plan to find a home, but rather to move to the modern version of hell. And it is worth noting that the Stalinist USSR that betrayed the Marxist cause and had a pact with Nazi Germany was not an option for him. Even if he would have not found his death at Porte-Bouc, he would have not found a home in the world as it was. But in spite of the dangers in the late 1930s in Paris, he remained there in his attempt to complete the Arcades project. When he understood he must flee with the Nazi occupation, he hid a copy of the drafts with the librarian in the Bibliothèque Nationale, Georges Bataille, who would later become a famous philosopher in his own right. During the rough journey from southern France to Porte-Bouc, crossing the Pyrenees, he carried with him a heavy suitcase in which, allegedly, he had the most updated draft of the Passage en Vogue, and it was never found. So I began with Dani Karavan's work as soliciting the question of whether it was possible for Benjamin, the author of the Passage en Vogue, to find refuge, to find a home. And as we are in the French Institut in Israel, I'd like to end with raising the question of the possibility of finding a home in our contemporary world, with a brief reference to the Israeli-French context. In Nadav Lapid's film Synonyms, the protagonist, Yoav, a young Israeli, flees from the madness he experienced in Israeli existence and finds refuge in Paris. He leaves the aesthetization of the political in Israel, the eros of death in the military, the constant anxiety of another Holocaust, and arrives to what he conceives as the emblem of European civilization. He attempts to assimilate in its language, in its culture, in its eros, yet eventually the film reveals the emptiness at the heart of Europe today, the lack of eros and vivacity, and the hypocrisy of liberté, égalité, fraternité in a state that forbids religious people to express their identity in public, and it shows, the film shows the kind of indoctrination you need to go through if you want to be a citizen. The film ends with Yoav plashing into a closed door. He flees Israel, but cannot find a home in France, and arguably in no other place. And one wonders whether this aporia of the home does not represent a large part of our world today, divided between authoritarian regimes and democracies in crisis, between the model of Putin's Russia and the model of Europe that cannot stand up to its highest ideals. Now, I admit that there is something fairly detached to speak about the impossibility of finding a home in the full sense of a meaningful place when millions in Benjamin's times, and as we heard from Sigal, in our own times, are struggling to find a home in a very basic sense of the world, a place in which they are physically safe. But if the current war in Ukraine is a struggle against the Ukrainian attempt to follow the European model in building a national home, the question of whether the realization of European ideals is possible at all has all to do with a problem of a proper home for the refugees. Moreover, if we return to Karavan's passages, to the sabra, to the olive oil tree, representations of Israel, Palestine, as he says, we might remind ourselves that here, where the question of the return of the refugees is always in the background, the question of the possibility and meaning of a home for refugees is something we will eventually need to face. Thank you.
Thank you, Ori. I want to come back to what Anne said earlier, and that you mentioned as well. It's this image, this idea of the tourbillon, the whirlpool, which for my father was unexpected, became like the essence of the work, and that he also said that this was a symbol of his strategy, of his. And I think in what you just talked about now, that I felt that the tourbillon was very strong there, really, in the life of Walter Benjamin, the fact that he did not feel at home in France and probably would have not felt at home in the USA, and in the story of Nadav Lapid's protagonist and so on. But you also mentioned to me that the tourbillon was something very essential, very important in Walter Benjamin's work.
Yeah, I just asked Anne if he knew, he used this image of the whirlpool as a methodical image. He talked about in a book called The Origin of German Trauerspiel, okay, a book on Baroque plays, mourning plays of mourning, not morning and evening, but yeah, mourning after death. So he uses this this image of origin as describing his way of constructing history, not as a stream, okay, not as progression and development, but rather the patterns you find in history, that you see them in this in moments of becoming, of almost things that are on the surface for a minute, for a few whiles, like in the whirlpool, they create a pattern, but then they disappear. And this was the image he had also. I mean, he used it for the Trauerspiel book, but it's also very pertinent regarding the arcades. This idea that you find something that is in history is very marginal. It's in disappearance, but you understand through it a pattern, like an essential pattern of modernity that is related to this innovation and what I said, this eternal return of innovation and death. So yeah, so I wondered whether you read about this. No.
I don't think so.
Apparently
I think
not.
No, but you had this kind of
intuition.
Yeah.
Intuition.
Always. Yeah.
I wanted to open it for questions from the public, if anybody wants to ask anything.
Yeah, you told that Walter Benjamin didn't find a home, but I disagree with you. Yeah, you told that Walter Benjamin didn't find a home. I disagree with you. Why? Because it was the misfortune of the German Jews. Their home was Germany. And a lot of German Jews committed suicide. Stefan Zweig, Josef Roth, many. So, when they left Germany, their how to tell that, their world disappeared.
So, I mean, it doesn't seem that you disagree, but it sounds that you think of a different kind of, okay, this issue of a German Jew, that his world disappears. But I want to, you know, you can think of Adorno, for instance, who had, was from Jewish descent, and he was a very close friend of Walter Benjamin, and came back to Germany, okay, to Frankfurt and the Frankfurt School, and again, I think they didn't find kind of, it wasn't a homecoming really. It was they even. It's a very difficult this difficult situation of criticizing and criticizing the place you are all the time. The critical theory, okay, criticizing the place you are in, and what is criticizing all the time and feeling at home and saying, you know, developing. Adorno even goes further with negative dialectics and really the negation thinks of the negation of this world. Okay, Benjamin was more optimistic in a sense. And okay, so.
But criticizing is also, I think, very Jewish in general. We tend to criticize all the time and still. Anybody else? No? So I just want to, before I thank everybody, I want to finish with a quotation. This is a quotation that is actually on the glass wall. When you go down the tunnel, there is a quotation of Walter Benjamin on the glass wall. And the quotation says, "It is a more arduous task to honor the memory of anonymous beings than that of famous persons. The construction of history is consecrated to the memory of those who have no name." Thank you very much. Thank you to the French Institute. Thank you, Ori. Thank you, Hava and Anne. Thank you, Yael, very, very much for all your help and patience and being there for us with this all. Thank you.